First Blacks of Canada Part 5, an Africville without Africans? By now, the story of Africville has become world-renowned, but like all legends, Africville is part fact and in large part myth. In cases like this, it helps to start the story from the beginning, which, surprisingly, is something that is rarely done throughout the Commonwealth. Most Commonwealth countries start their histories and history textbooks at the point of British arrival without any framing of context or explanation. This is a regrettable British tradition, which today's video corrects. In the Algonquin country, in its most eastern province of Lenum-Tgi, on the Enmigtakamoog Peninsula sat the provincial capital of Jipuktuk. It was one of the illustrious 7 cities of legendary world renowned in its day, and often the source of mythical grandeur. Jipuktuk, or the Great Harbor, was home to men of great stature and was a city never stepped upon by any European heel. According to Canada's founder, Samuel de Champlain, Jipuktuk, which he described as a healthy harbor, was untouchable from as far as Les Mortes, translated to the Islands of Death known today as McNabb's Island. As the eastern door to the Atlantic, Jipuktuk was both Algonquinia's incoming and outgoing trade hub. As such, Jipuktuk was fiercely defended. To the people of this nation, no portion of the civilization would have been worthy of more protection than Quebec. Quebec was the natural choke point of Jipuktuk's Great Harbor. Access to the city and the rest of the country's industry was vitally determined at this point. Not to be confused with the province and city of the same name, Quebec of Jipuktuk was also the place where the water narrows. However, Jipuktuk's Quebec was composed by 2 parts, the north and south shores, which would eventually become known by their British invaders as Turtle Grove and Africville, respectively. On June 21, 1749, the British would invade Jipuktuk, changing it irrevocably overnight. It is the reason why I am communicating with you now in English rather than in our indigenous language, Lenuismkai. It was at that point or thereabouts that Quebec ceased to be known by its Algonquin name as such, and had the name the Narrows insisted upon it. Though the invasion had taken place and governance had been afforded to the British, little demographic change took place with regards to the municipal population. In other words, the city of Jipuktuk was under new management and had been rebranded the city of Halifax. But aside from that, and the few Euro-vagrant immigrants Cornwallis brought with him, Jipuktuk was essentially business as usual. Little change to infrastructure or production, but Cornwallis and the boys did change the laws, ordering aggravated assault and racism by law. Starting on October 2, 1749, with this scalp bounty proclamation, he called to his officers and regular citizens for indigenous scalps, incentivizing civil murder, of course, but only of the undesirable Lenug population. The proclamation demanded all officers, civil, meaning police, military, and all His Majesty's, George II's, subjects, or others to annoy, distress, take, which is another way to say kidnap and or enslave, or destroy the savages called Lenug, Mi'kmaq, wherever they are found. To those who complied, the government awarded £10 or guineas, which by today's Canadian currency translates to $2,553.30. There was a bounty for each Lenug scalp or prisoner, whether they be men, women, or child. This Cornwallis proclamation is the origin of the uniquely passionate version of maritime racism that we find so potent and prevalent throughout contemporary history, and which had Euro-Nova Scotians sympathizing with the South during the Chesapeake Affair. Yet this did little to change the overall demographics, which wouldn't begin to change until the influx of the 1782 European loyalists. In 1782, some 30,000 British American loyalists began to arrive throughout the British claimed territories. Recorded in the Wentworth Papers and by the Nova Scotia Crown Land Office, there is a significant spike in land grants during this time, where nearly every square inch of the rebranded Kipuktuk was surveyed and granted to Europeans. The aim was to overwhelm the urban native Lenug with this new European loyalists' presence, though the turncoats were also allotted their share. In 1783, the English king felt it fitting to make a display of rewarding the Lenug, or as the Europeans had began referring to them, Mi'kmaq collaborators for their defection. The imperial governance of Nova Scotia issued occupation licenses to the Elnu factions, who had signed letters of fealty capitulating to England's king. These Lug, now defective for 2 decades, were referred to as the Mi'kmaq bands of Nova Scotia. The bands were now symbols of sovereignty and a promise kept by the foreign king, but were in practice only divided tribes squabbling over a seat at his governor's table. Where they had previously each been communities composing a powerful province in an extraordinary nation, now they knelt before a tyrannical despot. This tactic was meant to physically box the Lenug out of private ownership, making us illegal squatters on our own land. It didn't work. We refused to move or be harassed and terrorized out of our ancestral country. The residents of the Narrows were not just any residents of Kipuktuk. These were hardened intergenerational warriors, charged with being the last defense for 3 sacred sites. First Algonquinia, the whole of the rest of the Sacred Confederation. Then Kwawakejk, the central home mound of all of Kjipuktuk. And finally, Amtukati, the place of the ancestors, today found in Point Pleasant Park. When our ancestors refused to move out from the Narrows, they were met with violent outbursts and scuffles from the general public, which continued to leave us unmotivated, so new tactics began to be employed. It started with the militarization of the surrounding area, referred to as the Garrison State period from 1782 to 1799. This was the initial encroachment, where the British attempted to intimidate the Lenug of the Narrows by surrounding us with military installments, the dockyard, storehouses, and naval barracks. Restoration of the Kwawakejk Star Fort, which they were now calling the Citadel, also took place during these Garrison State years, but we were unmoved. Next, they'd use the construction of Fort Needham on the hill to overlook the Narrows, militarizing the heights of the North End and restricting civilian settlement in what had been common agricultural land. Even with their guns perpetually pointing down overhead, we knew no fear. By the 1800s, this Cold War stratagem had pretty much run its course. The LNU of the Narrows weren't budging, so the Brits finished the surrounded installments of the North Barracks at Brunswick and Cogswell, along with the expansion of battery fortifications on the Narrows shores. Taking notice of our bold defiance, the Brits began to switch tactics. Acting independent of any government, the British Royal Navy military state in Kjipuktuk started a type of military conscription called impressment, forcing Lenug enrollment. This translated into gangs of military thugs surrounding and scooping up what they refer to as the undocumented, but what actually translates to the LNU's men and boys. The impressed were then officially sent to the front lines in the Napoleonic War in Europe. In reality, they were sent to their deaths in whatever conflict the Brits wished them to go to. It was unlikely for them to ever be seen again. While some abductions took place in the core of Qipuktuk, the majority of the abductions took place in the Narrows. Naturally, the indigenous population was opposed to these abductions, which led to the riot of October 28, 1805. Losing the fighting-age men of a population has a multitude of severe effects on a community. Not only does it increase the burden of labor on their women, but it depletes the trade skills available, forcing the women to rely on men from outside of the community. It creates an economic dependency on foreigners, but lastly, and probably most importantly, is the psychological toll it takes on the remaining. It disarms you, perpetually alarms you, and makes you emotionally and physically vulnerable. While it wasn't all the men that were taken in this ordeal, we can only imagine the feeling for those families affected by impressment. By 1815, the acclimation of the local Lenugh population to British language ways and their systems had begun to make the Lenugh economically dependent on the Brits. The loss of our agricultural land to the construction of Fort Needham had a devastating side effect of making the Narrows Lenugh population dependent on the Brits for our sustenance. Give a man the license to feed you, and you allow him the ability to starve you. This is an adage that claiming Fort Needham caused the Brits to soon appreciate. Now that they'd inadvertently cut off the Narrows' agrarian lifestyle and food supply, they would use their financial monopoly to drain the life out of us through laws and policies. As a result of their conquest, the Brits had come to control the various industries and only employed their own foreign population before hiring or promoting our indigenous one. This fact, compounded with the Wampum Act of 1792, enacted by the Parliament of Lower Canada, served to crash the dominant domestic currency of the day. Wampum, which had been serving as the default currency of Canada, and until then had been exclusively produced and controlled by the Eastern Algonquin, who primarily consisted of the Lenugh. Consequently, Lenugh financial prowess would begin to lag significantly in and around 1800. From this orchestrated manipulation of the economy and subsequent legislation of new pauper laws, we see a status change. This was the birth of modern fake liberalism. Now notions came into play, like faux altruistism. Groups engrossed in inauthentic social engineering, like the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor, manipulated empathy in order to mass evict or gentrify we indigenous Niji. This organization, dedicated to convincing indigenous Niji to relocating to a colonization effort in Africa, was found literally killing two birds with one stone. Those proverbial birds being the indigenous American Niji, who was being used to kill the domestic African, and vice versa, in the pursuit of African lands and resources. The Commonwealth tacticians had a new weapon in their arsenal: compassion. They used it to lull us into a false sense of friendship in order to manipulate the El Nu against ourselves. They argued for the so-called protection of the unfortunate pauper, a legal fiction who, once labeled, automatically became a ward of the colony of Nova Scotia. This meant that as soon as Lenugh, who held Indian status from birth, were identified as paupers or poor people by government officials, they automatically became wards of the colony rather than sovereigns of their nation. That distinction demanded a new designation within the colonial system. European paupers were identified as poor whites, while Lenugh paupers who were abducted into the system were identified as poor blacks. Never mind the fact that the system itself was actively attempting to impoverish the indigenous through the means outlined above. These are all of the pertinent historical overarching facts about Qipuktuk's Kipeg, the Narrows, or what would become known as Africville and Turtle Grove, between the point of invasion in 1749 and when most histories start referring to the south side as Africville in 1848. As strikingly illuminating as this history is for the facts it contains, the most relevant point is that which it lacks. Please take notice, not one line states how the Lenug were finally, nor irrevocably evicted from the Narrows, nor how we lost our faith and abandoned our home. Neither is it factually written anywhere the number of Africans who disembarked when any arrived from afar. Neither do the registries nor artificial intelligence account for a single immigration into Africville until 1848. However, what does exist is a long, thorough, and accurate outline of El-New existence and resistance of British tyranny for 221 years from the point of Edward Cornwallis's invasion in 1749 until the final house was bulldozed in 1970. An incredibly honorable mention must go out to the final Lenug warrior who single-handedly held down the vacant field from its demolition in 1970 until his death on February 14, 2026. Uncle Eddie Carvery was a historical reference for us all and a model of persistence and resistance for 56 years. We salute you, Uncle Carvery, and dedicate this 5th installment to your immortal spirit. To Wasok, see you at Amantukati this year.